Добрый день, уважаемые эксперты.
Good afternoon, dear experts, dear participants. My name is Daria Lobanova. I'm Deputy Executive Director of the Gorchakov Fund. As you know, we regularly organize for discussions on some topical issues of the international agenda, and certainly cybersecurity remains on the table and will remain on the table as one of the key ones of the international agenda. This is something the whole world is focusing on. And our fund decided to organize a discussion on that very topic with the leading experts from Russia and abroad. It's a pleasure and privilege to see here today Mr. Krutskikh, Mr. Chernenko, who is going to moderate that event. And also, we are very glad that our foreign colleagues found time to join us online. Our French and our US colleagues are with us. Yelena, as I said, Chernenko will moderate the discussion, and I gladly pass the baton over to her. Daria, thank you so much. We're being broadcast, yeah? That's a privilege for me to moderate today's event, and certainly there is a big demand, a big request to discuss this very relevant topic. I must admit that I cover it for more than 10 years in every detail, with every passion and great attention to the details, and I'm becoming more and more pessimistic about the capacity of the states to agree on some rules of the game, or the traffic rules, as Mr. Krutskikh put that. And I hope that this discussion will add some optimism or will make us more alarmist, because Mr. Krutskikh is very cynical about that issue. And the very first question is whether the digital sector can be considered a new area of competition or cooperation. I will not be surprised if most of the participants in today's discussion would say that competition prevails, but are we hitting the bottom or not? I'm passing the floor to Mr. Krutskikh with any further ado. Mind you that Mr. Krutskikh is Director of the Department of National Informational Security. Can we call you a cyber czar, similar to the position in the United States, although the word czar was copied and pasted from Russia? Well, bearing in mind the informal nature of our discussion, I like that word. James Lewis, my American friend, knows that I'm far from being a royal member of the royal family, and as political scientists, we are discussing this topic without any formalities. Our expertise is more important, and it matters who we represent. So let's stage that discussion without any crowns or ties. So let's proceed with the business. I suggest that we allocate 10 minutes for every speaker. We have 4 speakers, so that then we could spend as much time as possible to the Q&A. Mr. Krutskikh, over to you. I'm not sure whether 10 minutes is enough for me. I do not count on 10 minutes, and I count on 2 hours of free-flow discussion with our colleagues from Russia and from abroad. Usually, and Yelena, you know that very well, I do not like reading from paper, never read anything out, but let me make one quotation, if I may, because it is very illustrative. This is the head of the defense staff, the United Kingdom general, back from 1939, actually. He said that the difference between the peace and the war is no longer existent, and that the traditional concept of the fight on land, on sea, and in air is obsolete or outdated. I do think that all the professionals, especially the military ones, would subscribe to that point of view. And that quotation illustrates very well the current state of affairs. Throughout the whole history of mankind, colleagues, we know very well that the new technological breakthroughs would bring the mankind to setting up new methodologies and new means of staging a war. And in that sense, ICTs probably are the most malicious, most harmful, and you know that I like exaggerations. As far as this is the piece of weapon which is really applicable, and it's very difficult to tell the difference between the peaceful use of these technologies and the use of them in the military purposes. The third trait, the third feature of these technologies is that they can touch upon everyone, the elites, the grassroots, the uniformed citizens, so to say, and as a result, they are omnipresent, ubiquitous. But there is a silver lining in all that. The period when Russia for 20 years had from scratch to be involved in reach out in the United Nations. After the very first contacts in '98, I was involved in that. I was doing that when only us and the Americans would understand what we were speaking about. When, for the first time, Clinton came to visit Boris Yeltsin in Moscow in 1998, and a very interesting pact was signed about the challenges of the third millennium. This is when we actually heard these words, that ICTs may be used for the sake of the mankind and for the detriment of the mankind. Ever since, we are servicing the United States, and eventually it was very close to wedding, to a marriage, actually, when we were close to sign an agreement, and we almost reached an agreement to never use these technologies in the malicious purposes, in the harmful purposes, or at least we were about building trust, measures of trust and confidence when using these technologies. Mr. Putin agreed with Mr. Obama to sign 3 intergovernmental agreements between our countries. So we also set up direct lines of communication between our presidents. But unfortunately, later on, the trust and confidence eroded. The ICTs proliferated around the globe, and the malicious use of these technologies increased. And now, actually, we speak about millions, if not billions. For instance, even the World Cup, which was hosted by Russia, saw 25 millions of cyber attacks against Russia, attempting to torpedo the World Cup in Russia. So it means that we may sound an alarm, and Russia is not alone to understand that. China realizes that. The SCO countries, including India and Pakistan and other SCO member states, they realize that. BRICS nations realize that, including Brazil. And therefore, we may say that all the countries are ready to discuss all the shades and tints of cybersecurity. I do believe that the American professional community, which I do hope is staying aside of the political propaganda and is standing aside of the political rhetoric. At least I would like to believe that the professional community in the United States realizes that a poor peace is better than a good war. And Yelena, I'm responding to your question because very often you reproach diplomacy that it just pays a lip service, saying some nice words but does nothing. But still, in the framework of the recent meetings, we managed to reiterate and confirmed that we should not kill each other using cyber weaponry, but rather continue our negotiations under the aegis of the United Nations, and therefore we have to fund the global diplomacy, including the Russian diplomacy. You may understand that I can read a whole lecture on that, but in order to hear the feedback from the colleagues, I would stop at that, and I'm ready to take part in any active discussion once we are allowed to do that. Thank you so much, Mr. Krutskikh, for such concise introductory words. I'm passing the floor with great pleasure to James Lewis, Senior Vice President, Director of the Strategic Technologies Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the United States. As Mr. Krutskikh said, we hope that the expert or professional community in the United States has its own independent point of view. We are keen to find out what you think about where we are going. I didn't say independent. I spoke about professional point of view. James, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me at this important conference. Hello to Andrey, haven't seen you in a while. I don't know if I'd call it a professional point of view in the US, but it's certainly a topic of great discussion. Where are we? First of all, the most important thing to note is the successful conclusion of the open-ended working group a few weeks ago, chaired by Ambassador Jörg Lauber of Switzerland, a very skillful diplomat. And the OEWG produced a number of noteworthy results, the most important of which was that it provided a global endorsement for the 2015 norms, the 11 norms agreed to in 2015. And now all countries have again endorsed them. So we have a framework for responsible state behavior. Perhaps the second most important thing was that it showed the UN can be a viable mechanism for negotiation. There was some doubt about this after its failure in 2017, and the OEWG has put that to rest. Of course, a success in the upcoming group of government experts meetings, of which Andrey, of course, represents Russia, a success in May when it concludes would reinforce these trends. One of the topics that came up that is worth thinking about is, should there be some sort of permanent UN activity? Some call it regular institutional dialogue. And there are two proposals. One is a program of action put forward by France and others. The other, of course, is another and longer open-ended working group proposed by many countries. One thing we can learn from this last round of negotiations is there's broad global interest in cybersecurity. And many countries have strong capabilities in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Latin America. So this is now a global issue with global participation. I think that what you would see in the US and some other countries is now what we could call a search for accountability. We have norms, but some ask, what is their use if no one pays attention to them? It's a fair question. So the search for accountability will dominate the discussion of cybersecurity in the US. It would be helpful if we could escape from Cold War terms like stability or escalation or deterrence. These are ideas from the 20th century. Perhaps we should begin to try and reconceptualize what is needed in cyberspace. Now, I think I'm agreeing with Andrey when I say that conflict is unavoidable. It's unavoidable, but it's manageable. This is not nuclear war. People who think of cyber catastrophe have forgotten what nuclear war meant. And of course, nuclear armed states have a threshold of action that they will not pass. There's a limit to what destruction they will cause because of the risk. Nuclear weapons have changed warfare, and they've changed it in a way that makes cyber operations a focal point for coercive activity among states. So my question is meaningful negotiation even possible at this time? There are very few incentives for this. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, both sides realized, of course, that they had come very close to a catastrophe. We have not yet seen a cyber catastrophe, so the incentive of survival is lacking. The rules we have, and this is a point that my Russian colleagues have made many times, the rules we have will need to be reconsidered, not only international law, but the rules we have for espionage, which really date from the 19th century. They're pre-internet rules. These are difficult topics. There is no agenda yet that encompasses them. So the issue for me is, how do we manage conflict? Because conflict is unavoidable. And then how do we get people to the table? How do we get people to the table in a way where they're willing to make concessions? And as you know, in any successful negotiation, both sides need to be willing to make concessions. Both sides need to have incentives to reach agreement. I think that the regular institutional dialogue, probably it will be both the program of action and the new open-ended working group, will move us in that direction, but we are not there yet. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, James. Благодарю вас, господин Lewis.
Mr. Lewis, thank you so much for your contribution. Thank you for such a concise and brief words of introduction. Lots of questions and issues which require some comments from the Russian side. Probably Mr. Krutskikh would like to have a quick response, but let me first pass the floor to Valentin Makarov, President of the Non-Commercial Partnership RUSSOFT, who actually represents an independent developer of software. He is one of the drivers of the multi-stakeholders dialogue. I don't like this word multi-stakeholding approach in Russia. Can we substitute the stakeholders for participants or parties? Actually, what's the place of business in this global standoff between the states in the cyberspace? Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Should I speak Russian? Well, actually, listening to the previous contribution, I understand that the introduction which you made as the moderator tells us that there is no way we can reconcile the interests of the states, regulators, secret services or security services in the scope that actually we could speak about trust and confidence. We speak about the internet as a means of communication between the people, but most likely, even today, we have to say that the main purpose of internet in the foreseeable future is to manage cyber and physical systems, where actually man factor is excluded from the critical infrastructure. When the artificial intelligence using the Internet of Things, IoT, actually would manage all the processes less costly and more efficiently, delegating the authority to the cyber physical systems. I think regulators would never trust the mechanisms which are set up by the diplomats. This is the domain, the realm of the politicians. But those who are responsible for cybersecurity, who are held accountable for that, would envisage certain protective measures which would allow, in any case, in case of sanctions being imposed or infringement of the agreements, would provide for safety and security for critical infrastructure. Industrial internet is totally different. The internet for people, and the prototype of that was created in France, and then actually it was replicated in the United States. This Internet for People was founded to ease the communication between the people, whereas industrial Internet was created for machines talking to machines. And the level of protection of such industrial Internet should be much better, much higher. There is a total different paradigm of internet. This difference between the internet for things and internet for humans is clearly very important. Probably we can set an agreement in terms of using internet for people, but it is not viable, it is not possible to agree on the rules of the game in the internet for machines. New technologies emerge in our life. Mobile internet, internet of things, quantum computation, quantum encryption. These things are changing the landscape of our negotiations. We cannot just agree that we follow certain rules on the internet. We have to agree on these new areas in technologies which originate from the internet but have a different purpose. And so these are my question signs, and I will stop at that. Thank you so much, Andrey. Well, actually, we have not passed the floor to everyone. Actually, I will ask Mr. Krutskikh to react to that later on, and I'm passing the floor to Julien, my good friend, who I had privilege to co-author one of the reports for the Volta Discussion Club. Julien actually is the Senior Associate Fellow at IFRI and Research Fellow at GEODE. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Yelena. I'm glad you recall this paper we wrote a few years ago, which I think would deserve to be continued in some way. Well, anyway, so thank you so much for inviting me today on discussing those complex and fascinating issues. Well, you all mentioned before me, I mean, diverse set of issues, of strategic, aspects dealing with cybersecurity and cyber weapons and so on. So I won't build so much on that in my very short talk at the moment. One question we may wonder, of course, is whether the COVID-19 pandemic has opened a new ground for a deepening of the sort of disordering of the international system in relation to the cyber world. I think it has, and I'm joining you in this assessment you made before of sort of remaining a bit pessimistic. So have the incentives every player, every actor, and states have in not trying to improve actually the rules of the game. So I won't. Dig too much into the pessimistic stuff because I think it's not the purpose today. One venue you both didn't mention before, and please don't smile at me when mentioning it, is the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace. I see you keep not smiling, so it's good. I'm very happy of that. And why I mention it right now is because. As you know, I remember it was presented nearly 3 years ago, 2 years and a half ago, in Paris during the IDF. At the time, it was the result of a long process of negotiation between different kind of participants. I'm not saying stakeholders here, as I just done before, and. It has been criticized a lot, and 3 major countries didn't sign the agreement. So Russia, China, and the US, for quite obvious purpose. But this is an agreement. Europeans at the moment, not only France, but many countries beyond in the EU and beyond the EU are seeking to promote, or at least to give a new impetus to 2 years and a half after this presentation. So afterwards, I'd love to hear you perhaps on this particular agreement, because I think some parts of it could be interesting to discuss. Not everything, of course, and I'm belonging to those who have been criticizing this agreement because some stakeholders I've tried to influence some parts of the agreement, and we come here to the long time issue of private corporations trying to weigh in the writing, of course, of some parts of the Paris School. Well, anyway, I didn't intend right now to focus on such issues. I saw very interestingly that in the summary of the conference that the sovereignty, issue was mentioned several times, and I just wanted to build on that because it's very interesting. Very interesting for at least one reason is that once again, seen from Europe through a European lens, there is much talk at the moment about in Europe about the digital sovereignty, about the technological strategic autonomy, and so on and so on. Not only from EU capitals, Paris, Berlin, London, and so on, but also from the EU itself. I'm not saying here that Europeans are so optimistic about that a brand new digital sovereignty will come from nowhere and so on. But anyway, the question here is: will the Europeans be deepen their ambition to reach this kind of digital sovereignty? How they will do it? This is basically discussed at the moment in Brussels, and this is new because when you hear quite often for the past, let's say, for the past 2 years in Brussels, in the Parliament and in the EU Commission, that they are talking a lot about strategic autonomy. It's very interesting. Why it's interesting? Because it's an expression which is directly taken from the strategic / defense, doctrine of sort of de Gaulle France for the past 3 or 4 decades. So there is a sort of extraction of this kind of vocabulary quite often to the EU level, and this is new. I'm not saying once again here that everything will change and that the Europeans will be able to build on that, but actually I think it should be noted because back to the cybersecurity and cyber defense levels, this is likely to have some implications in the near future because the CSIS also doubled with industrial at the industrial levels and doctrinal levels as well, of course. So I think this is an issue that we should not disconnect from. Part of the debate we have today, and another aspect which you might find a bit disconnected to the core of our topics today, but I think it's tightly tied in some way. It's the rise of geoeconomics we are observing we have been observing for the past 2-3 years, and which is reinforcing since the outburst of the pandemic of COVID-19. Because we are observing a sort of weaponization of major economic and digital and cyber stakes. And here, once again, the COVID-19 just highlights some of the pre-existing trends. So this is a global tech interdependence between different players, an interdependence which is still actual, but countered by the US and by China, with the much more geopolitical now topic of diversifying supply chains and all these debates around the decoupling and so on, which might have a profound impact for Europeans or Russia, by the way, as well, and so on. And so these are all very intertwined issues that I think should incite us not to focus exclusively on those long time debates around cyber stability and agreements and so on, but just to have a global picture of the issues which are all being blended in some way, because we are still living actually in a very interdependent context, which I think we might forget at some moments. So I'll stop here and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julien. Спасибо большое. Я не готовила нашим участникам вопрос.
I had not prepared questions for our participants ahead of time because I believe that the most interesting questions come up during the discussion, and they are usually set by the participants themselves. And at about 5 o'clock, we'll switch on to the Q&A session. I will ask our speakers to comment on the issues on the statements made by their colleagues. In particular, Mr. Krutskikh, I wanted you to comment on 3 issues. Number 1, Mr. Lewis mentioned that one shouldn't use cyberspace, or rather use in the cyberspace the terminology of the Cold War, such as the deterrent strategy. And so the discussion is going on whether this is a good concept. I will preempt your question. I totally agree with him. This is too brief. Can you expand? Yes, I can expound on this. These discussions have been going on for many years, whether we should use this old terminology and what kind of terminology we should use. But I believe that new technologies and new times give rise to a new language, new concepts, and new approaches. And therefore, the problem is that some countries are offering this discussion to take place, and others are looking for excuses to evade and avoid having the discussion on the topic. So the problem is not with the language you choose to discuss this matter. I'm ready to speak English or Spanish on my own, but it's the matter of terminology. And Mr. Lewis knows really well, because he's co-authored a lot of very bright ideas. I'm not trying to compliment him. I'm just emphasizing that we have jointly participated in lots of discussions together. And he knows that in Russia and in the Far East, at all of the negotiations platforms, have always been pushing one of the topics, the topic of developing a single terminological understanding of what we are actually discussing. And he probably knows really well, based on what were the initial discussions between government experts, how much time was spent by us professionally to try to understand what it is we are discussing, whether it's the information security or cybersecurity. Because in Russia, I had to, as it happened when it all started, to choose the right terms, and I appealed to US military sources and American regulations, military regulations, and they all used the term information security. And I clearly remember that when international negotiations at the UN started, and as part of the group of government experts we were involved in this, I remember the specific year when the US topic and terminology changed. They started talking about cybersecurity rather than information security. And if necessary, I can even give you the name of that great person on the US side. It was Michel Markov, the great and really serious negotiator on these broad range of topics. She was the one who suggested to use cyber instead of info in the phrase security. And this is important to understand what it is we are discussing. And if by cyber we only mean internet, well, let's call it that we are only discussing the internet at this point as a single term. But if we are talking about information and communication technologies, or ICTs, that involve various methodologies and technologies, then the Russian approach has always been to cover the entire mix of all ICTs, information and communication technologies. And from that standpoint, we cannot omit saying that whenever we're talking about information technologies, we have to talk about information. But years had to pass before we could find an agreement together with our US counterparts, homing in on the compromise-based terminology. Maybe it's lengthy, but at least it's freed up the need to discuss these two terms. Now this terminology sounds like this: security in the sphere of the use of information and communication technology, warfare in the sphere of information and communication technologies. This is a long phrase, but this is the worldwide used terminology. It's neutral and it's not harmful by itself, but whenever they're used for malicious purposes, they can become something similar to a weapon that can kill. And in conclusion of my intervention, I would like to say that terminology-wise, Russia has always been the proponent of developing a uniform type of terminology that would be used by us, the US and the EU and the rest of the world. And it's best to do that under the auspices of the United Nations and develop a dictionary or a vocabulary. And we couldn't agree more to these proposals. And we would be able to participate in this work as part of the first and third committee of the United Nations. And in all of the bilateral agreements of Russia and other countries, and there's more than several dozens of them, the very first articles are the articles that define terms and definitions. And we are prepared to be flexible when it comes to terminology. And we need to take into account the realities existing in every single country who's preventing the US counterparts to sit with us at the negotiating table and develop this vocabulary. And if this is something that would be of use to the Anglo-Saxon world, that's great. That means that we've done good work for them. And if it is something that is used by other countries, that's great also. And as a next negotiator, as part of the START treaty negotiations, I can say that back then in the US, they didn't have any allergy against the use of certain well-established terminology in the area of strategic stability and strategic weapons. All of the definitions were there in the treaties and the conventions. What is the cruise missile and what is the launch system, and how can you do this work without homing in on the right terminology? So my approach is to stop wasting time on demagoguery and assign our experts, lawyers, and all of these stakeholders and develop the terminology. But, throwing myself a little bit ahead of myself, and I've put some points here in front of me, I would like to say that the world is becoming more and more pragmatic. And the issue of terminology, be that ASEAN or BRICS or other associations, it's not something that causes these nations any allergy, so to speak. And everyone starts their negotiations with the development of some mutual understanding. Let me ask you to comment on the important issue that Mr. Makarov mentioned. The question was whether diplomacy is lagging behind when it is trying to regulate the internet and the World Wide Web, which facilitates communication between people. And the technologies are evolving so quickly that we're talking about a different level of the internet, IoT, AI, and so on. All of these things that have not yet been fully defined yet, at least at the first level. Do you have this feeling that you're always lagging behind as diplomats? If we are lagging behind, that's not happening because the terminology is dashing forward and is decoupling itself from us. It's because we, as diplomats, are often the victims of the political directives that we can see on the international arena. But fortunately, the experts community has agreed on one very important thing. One of the 13 rules or norms that is being cited as the Bible everywhere is that the key responsibility for ensuring cybersecurity is borne by a state, not by robots or aliens, but by the state, by the government. It is the state or the government and the governments that need to agree on everything that is related to cybersecurity. And this is the norm that was born out of an initiative that was spearheaded by the United States. And I clearly remember that, even visually, how Russia immediately supported that motion, because that's the right notion. The states are responsible for the behavior of its citizens, for their territories, and for everything that's happening there. It's very important to note here that, in response to what Mr. Makarov said, this is something that we need to regard as an incentive. This shouldn't give us heartburn or cause us to panic as negotiators. It's an incentive to try to reach an agreement quicker. We cannot afford to extend this for decades. We need to build the negotiating process effectively, and we need to involve all of these stakeholders and interested parties in this process. And this is a multi-stakeholder approach, as much as I'm averse to the use of stakeholder here. And this is the principle that we're going to be basing our efforts on. And all of the forces interested in reaching the compromise to prepare ourselves for a better future. All of these forces need to activate their efforts, step them up, and avoid saying that this is something that the EU will be doing it here, ASEAN will be doing it there, and the Five Eyes community will be doing it just for their own needs. And all of the other outsiders, so to speak, will be on the receiving end of our ultimatums. The world has changed. That's not going to work anymore. And we saw a revolution taking place in the world in 2018 when we offered a new open-end working group, because this is something that was a response to the initiative of all countries that were willing to participate in this process. But I will speak later about this negotiating process a little bit later. I don't want to monopolize and hog this discussion, because my colleagues have also been proposing nice ideas. And if I may, I would like to ask you one more question. But then nobody else will be able to comment on this one. Well, we'll move on to that later. Can you comment on the Paris call that Mr. Nocetti spoke about it? Russia did not accede to it, did not join it. And is there a chance you will, and why did this happen? Let me share a major global secret with you. In September of last year, Russia-France bilateral interagency consultations took place in Paris. That was an amazing conversation of professionals with huge delegates of several dozen people strong each. It was a great and amazing initiative of Presidents Putin and Macron. And it was manifested in the fact that we had an opportunity to have a very detailed discussion in Paris. And we were the first ones to whom the French told about their plans with regard to the call for action. And I was the first one who said that we don't have any allergy against this or to this international idea or initiative, initially spearheaded by the French. And it later became a broader international idea and proposal. But then in September and later on, we figured out that we need to further specify this initiative. What has Russia done as it worked on the bilateral initiative, which is in line with the level of presidential relations? We suggested that we need to discuss this action plan as part of the open-end working group that will initiate its work in June of 2021. And as a result, both France and its partners on this initiative have invited businesses and countries to participate in this. And Russia has suggested the whole of the United Nations mechanism, essentially the General Assembly of the United Nations, as a platform for discussing this topic. Moreover, we have a veto power as part of this negotiating process, all of us and all of the participants of the negotiations. And that makes the discussion a responsible discussion. No one can impose anything on anyone, and the voice of every country will be heard. And we have essentially created a platform for a very broad discussion of this initiative, and we are prepared to make our own constructive contribution to this process, and we can't wait for the start of this work of the open-end working group. And so we don't want to create an impression that we're entering some kind of conflict and that we need to create some kind of second track of negotiations. I think that is something that is done on purpose by those who want to mar the French initiative and undermine its authority, preventing France and its partners from implementing this initiative in the broadest context of states' participation in this. I'm talking about the United Nations member states. And it seems to me that this is the initiative that needs to be further clarified, and it does require collective participation by everyone. Thank you so much. If I may, I would like to direct the question to Mr. James Lewis. When Russia says or speaks about norms and rules and agreements, if I'm understanding correctly, we are talking about some legally binding norms and rules. That's what our president spoke on many occasions about this, and Mr. Krutskikh spoke about this also. Do you think it is possible or necessary to lead things towards that end, especially considering that US officials are saying no, they don't want to achieve this goal? And another clarifying question is, you emphasized in your intervention that the working open-ended working group has been quite successful in approving a consensus report, and many stated that that was quite a breakthrough. But the question I have is, what relation does it have to the events that are unfolding in the cyberspace? Because this is nothing more than just a moral compass and beacon, so to speak, because we are talking about a cyber code where we want the good things, but it has very little bearing on the real life. But how can we bridge the good intentions and the real agreements? But it wasn't Andrey Krutskikh who said it, but it was Yelena Chernenko who did, and I was only quoting from the classics.
Well, thank you. Both are very interesting questions. Andrey may remember, I think you were my boss when I did this, but one of the models we used for developing the idea of norms and confidence building measures as the basis for agreement in cyberspace, one of the models we used was the missile technology control regime. Not because the technologies are the same, but because this is a non-binding political agreement among states. And states politically agree to observe it. There are calls, and so that's the crucial first step, is there political agreement. There are calls for a digital Geneva Convention. I think those are premature. The actual Geneva Convention, of course, occurred after a war. We would prefer that not happen, but there is not yet enough common understandings to come to a legally binding agreement. Andrey knows that I think that ultimately we will get there, but there is much work to be done before we get there. What you can say then about what are the value of these non-binding agreements, and that is that they create a foundation for progress. They create a foundation for further agreement. There are groups of states who have now said, here are these 13 norms. We agree to practice them, to observe them in our behavior. And that's the foundation for improvement. I think what we need to do then, that makes one of the tasks of negotiation. How do we extend the number of states who observe these norms? So legally binding, perhaps in the future, but not now. Value of non-legally binding, it gives us the foundation for cooperation and future work.
Thank you so much, Mr. Lewis. The question for Mr. Makarov is, to what extent can a state, including a Russian state, take into account the interests of the businesses when they try to make agreements on the international level? And I understand RUSSOFT did not participate as a business representative in the process of negotiations of the open-ended working group. If I understand, only Kaspersky labs were representing Russia there at those talks. And why was that? And is RUSSOFT going to join that process later on or going forward? We do represent the business community, and we are there for doing business. And the state's attitude towards cyber security and its arrangements with other states on cybersecurity, we see that the general approach is right. And I don't believe that there is a need for us to intervene. And many of the necessary things are being said by the states. Yes, you're right. We haven't yet participated in this, but all of the information that was discussed there, I have been privy to this information, and as the head of RUSSOFT, I was this information was made available to us, and we have been kept abreast of what's going on. And we were not that active, probably because we don't believe that we can offer anything on top of what has been suggested by Russia. and that meets our interests. Kaspersky Labs are there, and we know that it's an appropriate thing for them to be there. Let me also mention that Mr. Krutskikh said something in his intervention when he spoke about agreements reached by diplomats. This is similar to legislative rules set by parliamentarians, for example, but there's also an executive power, and the internet that we're using is a truly American system. Well, there is ICANN in California, the organization registered there, and I think out of 21 members of the board of directors are United States citizens. This is regulated by US laws, and therefore the executive power belongs to one country, essentially, despite the fact the Russian side has made proposals, and Brazil too, to make it happen so that ICANN would be, let's say, under the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, but that idea wasn't supported yet. So we have the legislative power that does everything right, and the executive power that essentially reports to one state. There's a risk that the executive power will not be acting on everyone's behalf. That risk remains, and therefore our movement towards giving this executive power to ITU or to others, it's a good strategic track. And I can understand the Americans because they've spent so much time and effort, including intellectual effort, to create the World Wide Web and the internet for everyone. And that certainly deserves to be given credit to them for that. And a lot of thanks from everyone. But time flies by very quickly. And the idea that this is something that can be regulated by non-profit organizations, but American nonetheless, and the keeping of the data centers in the United States and some in Japan and Holland and Sweden, it doesn't guarantee that someone may switch off the internet if they decide. So we need to build confidence through the executive powers and not just through legislative powers. Thank you so much. Mr. Krutskikh had to leave us for several minutes because he has received a call from his leadership, and he'll be back as soon as he can. And now I would like to ask my question to Mr. Nocetti. Two questions. The first one of them is a request, similar to the request to Mr. Lewis, is to comment on the value and of the agreements that were reached by the open-ended group, the consensus report, 13 norms. Their practical applicability, whether they make any sense, and whether this is just a paper tiger. And the second question is something that deals with the global agreement, something that Mr. Krutskikh was talking about. So several autonomous rules can be set for various regions, for the EU, for ASEAN, and others. And then there's a global procedure. Is this something that is controversial to itself, or is this something that can be joined together?
Thank you for these questions. Just before answering, just wanted to very quickly build on what has been said just before. When we are mentioning and discussing the state first, opinion and approach in cybersecurity, there's a very commonplace stuff to remind that the private sector worldwide owns much of the infrastructure. This is very complex, as I've just said, but the question here is how states, how government and other players, build a sort of balance of power with companies to achieve their own goal. But well, anyway, on the words of Ambassador Krutskikh on the dialogue between Russia and France. Well, I've pretty well understood that that the Russian government favors the bilateral processes rather than the sort of Paris Call type of agreements. This is traditional for the Russian diplomacy, and I perfectly understand that. However, all good may have been the dialogue between both countries in this regard. The broader, diplomatic and strategic atmosphere, has much influence on these discussions. So I think we should not overestimate one particular meeting or two meetings in this regard between both countries or other European partners. To answer your questions, and I would not say that the OEWG is a paper tiger document. I would of course assess this kind of argument. However, once again, I think much of the flavor of the documents, owns much on the strategic context, which is shifting. First of all, through the COVID-19, pandemic, and then with the arrival of Joe Biden as president of the U.S. So I would not be as optimistic as some of the speakers before in relation to this document. However, I think the next couple of months will perhaps show something a bit different. And then on the dichotomy between the very nature of the likely agreements on cyber between global or regional venues and documents and convention and so on, I think it's very interesting, because one of the trends we've been observing for the past let's say for the past 6 or 7 years is clearly a sort of regionalization of the processes in diplomatic terms or commercial when it comes to digital economy, and I think this is a trend which is expected to grow in the next few years. So to favor regional venues, you mentioned Yelena, the ASEAN or the European Union and so on, and together with the so-called fragmentation of the digital spaces around the world, I think this is something we should expect. So how do major companies deal with that? It's a major issue, of course. So it's quite hard. It's quite delicate to do some forecast about that. But I think we should also in this equation. I'm just sort of trying to describe, we should add China in the equation. So it's a country we have not been mentioning so far. So quite curiously, and I'm always eager to know what Ambassador Krutskikh is thinking about the Chinese role and influence in the debates, in the OWG process, and so on and so on, and whether it's still it's pertinent to talk about Russian-Chinese partnership in this regard. So given all these high-level ambitions of the Chinese leaderships when it comes to reformatting the global governance around its own principle and egoistic interests. So I'd like to perhaps ask this question through Yelena. And yeah, thank you.
Спасибо большое, Julien. У нас сейчас...
Thank you so much, Julien. Actually, it's 5 o'clock now, and we right on time to proceed with Q&A session. I suggest that first we give the floor to the audience here in the Gorchakov Fund, and there are some questions which we received from the viewers online. Any volunteers to ask a question, please introduce yourself and ask your question, and please tell us who this question is directed to. Push the button, mic on, mic off. Good afternoon, the experts. Thank you so much for your discussion. I have a question to Mr. Makarov. Obviously, the mic doesn't work.
Я присоединяюсь к этому вопросу. Я думаю, что многие здесь знают. Только подумаешь о красном платье. Теперь уже Яндекс выдает ссылки на продажу красных платьев.
You just think about a red dress and immediately the Google search shows the red dress to you.
Валентин Леонидович, вы слышали вопрос?
Я только слышу фамилию Макаров, а больше ничего не слышал.
Actually, I didn't get the question. I didn't hear the question. I heard only that I was asked about that. Take the mic, please. Tell us, please. Can you hear me now? Yes, I do. Excellent. Let me briefly repeat the question. Do you agree that the state and the business can be joined in the efforts to protect the consumers against misleading advertisement on the internet? And at the moment, are there any regulatory requirements to the online advertisement? And if there are no such regulations, will we still see the chaos? Thank you so much. Actually, business can consume everything. On the one hand, it consumes the internet traffic in order to offer to you the red dress with a discount, but on the other hand, the business is ready to protect you so that you do not get any such misleading advertisements at all. And we have even a project called Safety and Security Cocoon, when actually a person may set up a digital twin to operate the internet. This digital twin would filter unneeded requests and queries, and therefore would protect a person against a certain third-party interference. So the business works on both parties, and probably will no longer work for the advertisers. We are good, seemingly, but this is not true. As far as there is a market for that, we are going to do that. This is up to the state to actually issue the regulations would actually favor a man rather than a business. Thank you so much. We have a very first question online from Mr. Shakirov, and Daria will voice it out, will spell it out. Question goes to Mr. Krutskikh. One of the novelties of the open-ended working group is about the consultations with business, NGOs, and scientists and experts. And Russia actually did not delegate anyone, but Kaspersky, which positions itself as an international company. Do you think that the Russian corporations would take a more active part in the discussions within the OEWG? Well, that's an excellent question, because it allows me right now spell out the position which actually will bring to the new session of the open-ended working group. We have to proceed from discussions to practical steps and practical negotiations. And negotiations are different from the discussions that actually we are not discussing anything for the sake of discussion, with no structure and with no purpose. One of the major changes in the Russian stance is that we suggest that the new OEWG should follow some specialized structure. The business questions have to be discussed by the businessmen. The questions of legal nature have to be discussed by the lawyers. The question of aid to the developing nations or capacity building issues are discussed by the emerging markets or the developing nations themselves. There should be a subsection or subgroup which will deal with gender equality issues and other issues. In that sense, for quite a while we were thinking that business is quite active in terms of ensuring cybersecurity. Certain ideas were proposed about setting up and signing of Geneva Convention. Besides, the Russian business, represented by Sberbank, proposed their own initiatives, and annually they hold large-scale cybersecurity conferences. And actually, there are some open international drills on that. I know that Nornickel, one of the biggest Russian transnational companies, suggested a charter of cybersecurity for major corporations. So the Russian business, as well as the international business, are very much interested in these issues, and this is very vital for them. This is a vital and pivotal question which has to be addressed. Therefore, we suggest that one of the subgroups within the OEWG is focusing on the exchange of opinions between the politicians and businessmen, so that not us, the politicians, are instructing the business how to make money, but at the same time we have to make businessmen realize how and understand how the political processes go on. And altogether we can develop the fair trade principles, the principles of interaction in the cyberspace. So it just like was excellently and brilliantly done by France when it held the last meeting of G8 in Deauville, when Paris saw about 1,500 of participants. Out of them, half were businessmen. Their main objective was to have a discussion and then to report to the G8 leaders what business thinks about cybersecurity. We make step forward, not just discuss the things, but we'll try to develop certain legislative norms or principles, certain regulations. I'm not sure what legal term I may find for them. Probably it would translate into a UN resolution, but at least it will help us to have a large-scale discussion between the politicians and corporations from all the UN member states on cybersecurity. It would be a kind of a mock session we already had, a prototype of such session we already had when the OEWG was presided by a Singaporean minister, a seasoned diplomat and career officer. He was a chairman in the United Nations, and I may admit that at that time only Kaspersky was present from the side of the Russian business. Other businesses were not present. And this is not because the Russian business was not aware of that, but they were just not sure of the scale of that international process. Now, I do think that after the success of the OEWG, the Russian business realizes that they have to be directly involved in these negotiations in order to provide for security of business and to develop certain principles of political behavior in that realm. Thank you so much, Mr. Krutskikh. Do we have any questions from the floor? Yes, I see a hand raised, and please introduce yourself and tell us who you direct this question to. Evgeny Bedanov from International Life Journal. My question goes to Mr. Krutskikh. If peace and cyber war is the same thing, then how will the relations and ties between the states and business would transform in Russia and in the United States? No, I did not get your question. Well, you made a quotation from the very outset that the war and peace in cyberspace are all the same things. How will the relations between the state and business change in that respect? Well, actually, there will be no changes. That's a question of a political process. You have to differentiate different phases and stages. There is a stage of negotiations, a stage of confrontation, a stage of standoff and counteraction. And I have a question which I'd like to direct to James, Lewis, and my other interlocutors. And that would be an answer to your question, and at the same time, it would explain the difference in the approach used by Russia and other countries. For instance, James stressed, if you certainly notice that the conflicts are inevitable, and if we have to agree on the manageability, on the management of the conflicts. This is what differs the Russian approach from other approaches. We stand up for the prevention of conflicts. And when we suggested to the United States certain initiatives of bilateral nature, it was not about the steering of the conflicts, but it was about prevention of the conflicts. This is the most pivotal difference between our stances. I do think that more expert communities in more states in the world now realize the rationale behind the Russian offer, the Russian proposition. So once the conflict breaks out, we'll have to think about our souls rather than manageability. I think that we'd rather think about prevention, and management actually would be the side product of that. Let me get back to the second question, which I recorded. Binding norms and binding regulations, or non-binding and voluntary norms. Non-binding and voluntary for whom? For the strong ones or for the weak ones? We will not come up to this with a situation, and this is not the Russian concept, this is the Western concept, which we agreed to as a compromise within the group of governmental experts. This voluntary nature and non-binding nature for one countries, but at the same time it is binding and mandatory for other countries. Don't we see again an attempt to divide, to make a divide between the countries which are free to interpret the international law and the ones which are not entitled to that? The third question, which also quite dramatic, but in terms of the diplomatic talks, this is called a technical term. Are we speaking about standing or temporary negotiations? Should it be versatile under the aegis of the United Nations? Internet is a global technology. ICT is a global technology. Cybersecurity is a global problem. But if you analyze who is voting against the discussion of that topic in the United Nations, you will see about 40, but no more than 50 Western countries, which all the time are voting against the Russia's propositions on setting up a United Nations negotiation process. Afterwards, these countries would join that negotiation and would then call it a big success and would reap all the benefits of that. Don't you see that this is a kind of hypocrisy? The processes which are offered by Russia, if they are then being captured by the international society, they make us discuss these things and then claim a success then, probably. We don't have to try to impede these processes. I mean, the international community. Another question. Do we need several negotiation tracks, or we need one track, but which would be systematized in terms of certain directions? We, for instance, believe that once there is no contradiction between our concept, the OEWG concept and the French one, the French initiative, let us discuss everything all together, but in every detail. More specifically, we're told that they do not trust us because we will somehow seize the domination, and some ungrounded suspicions are being raised, and we hear the hints that some groups of countries are going to discuss something in detachment from Russia. You cannot secretly discuss global problems. It is totally internationally irresponsible. Therefore, the topic of verification of cyber attacks and their attribution is crucial. There is a concept that it should be a responsible system set up under the aegis of the United Nations, that every country would trust this system. But if such a system again lies within certain division, within certain divide, it will no longer be objective if it belongs to just one group of the countries. It will translate into a means of propaganda, vehicle of propaganda. It will not perform its main objective, giving the world a real possibility to know who is the aggressor. Hence, I remain an optimist. The world realizes more and more, just like in case of COVID-19, the same is true of cyber viruses and cybersecurity. No longer you can be complacent and pay lip service. We have to walk the talk. If we actually use the same rules of the game as are being used to vaccines used, if the cyberspace and cybersecurity is used in the political interest, then we'll not come up with anything good. But I do see that the international community is now coming up to the common understanding that ranging from elites to grassroots now realize that we have to develop certain rules. And this understanding became stronger, and we do not need confrontation and ideological strife, but we need some basic resolutions, basic decisions. We have to somehow start implementing them. Mr. Lewis, do you want to react to what Mr. Krutskikh said?
Sure, please.
For instance, as concerns the prevention of conflicts and management of conflicts.
It's very appropriate that we're doing this at the Gorchakov Foundation, because, of course, the great Russian diplomat led the efforts in the 19th century to achieve some kind of stability among the conflicting powers. And what we will see in the future, at least in the near term, will not be a new concert of powers. Perhaps we had that in 1945, but it will not be a concert of powers. It will, however, be a great power competition. And that is the nature of the international environment in which we're in today. And there's many great powers. There's India, there's Europe, there's the US, there's Russia, there's China, there's a few others. So that's the world we're in. Our discussion has a strategic, what I would call a discontinuity, right? Because the countries that want stability means no change, right? And there are clearly other countries that want change. So we all say stability, but we have very different meanings, right? Now, this conflict, I said before, is unavoidable. It will not be a violent conflict of the kind we saw in the past. It's unavoidable, but I think the thing that gives me hope is that it's unwinnable. No one is going to win this conflict, right? It's not that the US will be defeated or that China will be defeated. So we're at the start of a long process of developing common views. And these different vehicles, the Paris Call, the Program of Action, the new OEWG, the final phase of the group of government experts, these are all mechanisms for us to begin to develop the common views that may let the great powers who are now in conflict in cyberspace, and we don't need to pretend that we aren't, we're all doing the same thing. but it will let them perhaps reach some common understanding some years from now that will allow for a reduction of conflict and stability. I'll stop there.
Господин Льюис, вам адресован вопрос.
Mr. Lewis, we have another question from one of our viewers. Sergei Sibekin asks you, under Donald Trump, a strategy of persistent engagement in cyberspace was adopted. In your opinion, will this strategy be followed under Joe Biden?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. I think the answer is yes. It may evolve. There was some internal debate over how to respond to the SolarWinds incident. And there were some who would have preferred a more assertive response using cyber operations. And there are others who wish to avoid that. And so we ended up with kind of a middle position. I think what you'll see under the Biden administration, first of all, let me say it's an exceptionally powerful team responsible for cyber, not just General Nakasone, but the people at the NSC, the new cyber director, the Department of Justice, the CISA at Homeland Security. A very powerful team has been assembled, but I think persistent engagement is something that will continue. It may be modified. It may be adjusted. One key difference is this is, because of its very strong team, a much more coherent administration. And so I think what you should look forward to is the coherent application of persistent engagement and defend forward, not an end to them. Thank you.
Спасибо большое. Я возьму еще один вопрос из
онлайн.
Thank
you so much, and we'll take one more question from Oleg Shakirov. He asks Julien Nocetti. Since 2019, the Russian-French contacts on cyber threats were resumed. How this process is being perceived in France, and what are the expectations by the French experts?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Actually, yes, it's quite interesting because when we discussed the reviving of the bilateral dialogue between France and Russia 2 years ago, yeah, exactly 2 years ago, actually the start was very low, and actually the impulse was really given at the highest level by both presidents, and several commissions were implemented. Not so much. Well, I'm talking about France here specifically. Not so much within the diplomatic apparatus, so within the MFA, but within the National Agency for securing information systems. So which is mostly known as under its acronym ANSI, and this organization has taken much influence within the cybersecurity, cyber defense landscape in France, and is trying to be part of the game of the negotiations when it comes to terminology or some international processes. So with Russia, it was the case, and there was some kind of as in the US, sometimes, by the way, it's not specific to France, but he had some bureaucratic rivalries, some competition between different agencies when it came to outreach with foreign partners or rivals. So in the case of Russia, it was interesting because the process lasted something like 1 year before relations came with ups and downs, given the much broader general context of diplomatic and strategic tensions, which does not come as a surprise. But the cybersecurity, actually, part of them is really dependent from much broader context. So I would say it's sometimes being taken in something like hostage of these much broader negotiations and tensions. And I'm not sure that with in the US, the Joe Biden administration arriving in power and the the processes and the way of reviving the transatlantic alliance and transatlantic partnerships, I'm not sure that France and some of its partners in Europe, like Germany, for example, would be eager to turn again to Russia or other countries eastwards. And I think that they would try to. Paris will definitely try to turn again to Washington with, as James just told before, many very competent people arrived in the different cyber departments and agencies. So this is something I think Europeans will be reassured actually to fight back the US as a competent partner when it comes to such issues. So on the future of the France-Russia cyber dialogue, I would not be totally pessimistic, and I'm not saying that no, we should not pursue the process. Of course not. I think it's extremely important, but I think given the context I've just described with in the US. And the overall Chinese-U.S. spat, I'm not sure that the dialogue with Russia is the key priority at the moment. Once again, it may change, of course, during the next months, and especially before the next French presidential elections, which is set to take place in May next year, and we surely will surely expect some tensions in the information and cyberspace. I'm not saying here that Russia is mentioned. Many other players, like countries, are supposed to interfere in some way. So I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Julien. Are there any questions from the audience? Yes, please. Hello, once again. I have a question for Mr. Krutskikh. You need to introduce yourself. My name is Dmitry Konukhov. I work for the government of Moscow, but here I am as an independent researcher. Mr. Krutskikh, here's my question. Speaking about separate development of norms, institutions, and rules, and the terminology of Cold War, to continue on that subject. Since the end of last year, the Western experts community has been using increasingly this new narrative that, or the new paradigm, technocrats or autocrats against techno-democrats. Autocrats against techno-democrats, and this is the terminology that is being used by Professor Kleinwachter, an luminary in this field, and he mentioned this as part of his interview to the Congress, State Secretary Blinken, as he was being interviewed by the Congress. This narrative, or this juxtaposition, says that there has to be a union of techno-democrats, T12, that will be made up of the allies of the United States, and that will be used to block norms and institutions that would be aimed at using innovative technologies. The United States, on the doctrinal level and on the practical level, will be going away increasingly from discussing these matters within the existing platforms. And as part of the discussion of the International Electrical Communication Union, they usually block any mentioning technologies, new and emerging ones, or going away from doing that. And in their doctrinal documents, such as the report of the National AI Commission or the National Strategy for New and Vital Technologies that was released in the fall of last year, the US says that in order to maintain its leadership in these fields, they need to make alliances with their closest allies and discuss those norms and institutions with them. The question I have is, what is your assessment of the viability of this informal union of developed nations who would be discussing something without those whom they call techno-autocrats, such as Russia and China. That's their own terminology. Is such an idea viable in principle? Then what can Russia do to counteract this, other than working within the existing formats and on the existing platforms, and perhaps in taking steps to intensify bilateral cooperation that could be part of such alliances? I will try to address this question from the standpoint of common logic. I am not aware of how deeply these 12 countries, or whatever the number is, involved in the discussion of these matters. But common sense suggests that it's hard to create something viable by excluding from the discussion such giants as Russia, China, and so on. The second principle that is not going to work, and it's not going to allow anything to work, is that in addition to Russia and China, there's also Brazil, BRICS, Iran, and a number of serious nations that have their own regional, albeit, but still potential. They're influential countries. And any cooperation should not be built on the principle of being friends against someone, or building your world against somebody else. This will lead to either a splitting world, where everyone will be entrenched in their own parts of the front line, or there will be further confrontation and nothing good will come out of this. And it seems to me that the power of information technologies and biotechnologies show this separatist mentality that would be based on just one type of approach, well, say a US vaccine. It's not going to work because they're not able to produce the equivalent number that the world needs of those vaccines. And the world has become more diversified and smarter technologically. And if the US wants to build the world that would consist of 12 countries and then compete with China, well, all the power to them, but they will also have to compete with China's partners as well. I'm not a proponent of a theory of the 5G technology that is right, democratic and good, and then there's also a malevolent and evil 5G technology. That's the type of narrative that is used by those who are lagging behind in those techs, and they just want to compromise these technologies. I'm not going to go into this discussion of the Brazil's situation with our vaccine, because one authority there made one decision, the other made another, and slow things down. But it seems to me that Russia is sufficiently open in its technological development, and everyone has ways to verify what Russia's claims are, instead of substituting this pragmatic verification with demagoguery and name-calling. And we've seen precedents, the discussion of the establishment of a club to discuss the economic problems, the G20 club, and then others are following suit. This is a broader club, and we are not talking about creating the group of 5 or 7 or 3 countries. It's 20 at least. And so from the standpoint of pure logic, to answer your question, and discussing this as a colleague with a colleague, it seems to me that politically and demagogically you can try to use various structures, but the world is on a track of development, and if we were to follow subjective factors, the world would have ceased to exist a long time ago. And at some point, everyone understands that we need to build a bridge across the river rather than in parallel to it. So thank you very much, Mr. Krutskikh. One next question is to you from the online chain, asked by the second-year student of a master's degree program, Ilya Starchilo, Strategic and Arms Control Studies course. Which partners are the most important for Russia in terms of signing a bilateral agreement? Well, that's a good question, and the answer to this will be quite original. All partners are good. The uniqueness of these technologies is such that within the framework of these technologies, there are no small or big nations. Everyone is on the same level. And there was someone from Garmisch-Partenkirchen. I'm not going to say whose country he represents. He said that we represent a small European nation, but thanks to cyber technologies, we have reached a level where we are going to lose any war initiated against us. We are going to lose it to anyone, but we can bite a large elephant so painfully that the elephant will suffer. So I think that kind of thinking is an indication that every country is valuable. And if we look at the countries with whom we enter into bilateral agreements, they include such giants as India, Brazil, China, and all other BRICS countries, plus South Africa. But there are also smaller countries that are involved, and we do not distinguish more important countries from less important countries. And we think that if we cannot reach a global and universal UN-led treaty or convention that would involve on equal basis all participants who are willing, then we need to enter into bilateral agreements in the area of cybersecurity if they wish so. Because if you read through these agreements, they are no secret to anyone. They are publicly available. These agreements are about cooperation and not about being friends against someone. It's not an alliance. It's not a military political groups or blocks. It's a type of an agreement that presumes technological cooperation. And one portion of such agreements is that the participants try to guarantee each other against confusion and suspicions against each other. If I may, I'd like to ask one more question to Julien. Nocetti said that we're not talking a lot about such an important elephant in the room as China. Russia entered into a bilateral agreement in 2015 with China. And how is this going there? Well, China is a giant. It's not just an elephant, it's a super elephant. But I would rather give the floor to, or rather, I would rather like to suggest that we have a separate conversation with my colleague from France on such a giant as China. And in the remaining time today, I think we're not going to be able to get to the gist of this discussion. The important thing here is that we should never oppose anyone against another party. Instead, we should exchange the best technologies that various countries produce and market, and we just need to take advantage of these advancements, and instead of trying to use these technologies for ideological purposes. Because if we were to follow this approach, when internet was invented, half of the world could have gone by using somebody else's internet, for example. Thank you. Are there any questions here in the room for the speakers? If not, I would like to ask one more question. James Lewis spoke about this earlier. He mentioned this idea. I would like to hear your comment, Mr. Krutskikh, and possibly Julien, Nocetti, and Mr. Makarov. To what extent is the concept of using the regime of limiting export technologies in the military, such as missile sector, applicable to cyber sector? Can we use existing regimes and then sort of transfer to cyber technologies, be that strategic arms control or disarmament? Can we use them for the cyber security, which is now semi-voluntary? Who's going to be the first? Mr. Makarov, maybe you will be the first one to try to answer this. Are these regimes applicable? Well, I'm not a diplomat. I'm just a civilian, but I can say that we have some statistics. We are measuring markets every year and trying to estimate which markets are more interesting for us to a greater extent. And last year, developers of software, including security developers, are saying that right now, France is #1 country that interests them more. And in Asia, it's Japan and Vietnam. And here's why. It just happens so that in Europe, the security system in Europe for a long time had been based on US technologies. And in France, as I was told by French experts, they stopped developing their cryptography school in France. But several years went on. And then the French realized that they are very dependent on America in the area of cryptography, and they cannot guarantee themselves against a third party interfering with their work, let's say the United States. So in Europe, maybe it's time for large countries such as France, Germany, and others to enter into an alliance to build a third pole of security. There is America, there is China, and Russia together with Europe can be such a pole of security. And the similar situation is in Asia. Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, and others could build yet another pole of security for the Southeast Asia. And I think we think that the US market produces about half or more than half of our export income. And despite the sanctions, some of the US companies were incentivized to work with Russia because it stabilizes the situation somehow based on the overall moral principles that work better for them as against the ones that are being imposed right now in them. And moving to Southeast Asia is quite important for us as well. To the developing nations, the market there is expanding very rapidly from 5% several years ago to 12% recently. And as to more intricate issues such as missile agreements and treaties, I think there are some differences between these technologies, because missiles mean destruction and the destruction of the planet of Earth. But when we talk about cybersecurity or cryptography, that's not as damaging. And it's good to have an equilibrium. And right now, this equilibrium, no one has a predominant position that can destroy the other's assets. So this equilibrium is there, and it will continue being there, because people are interacting, and one cannot count on making sure that measures can be taken to be similar to the measures that had been taken in the past with regard to missile defense. We believe we need to have different mechanisms for cybersecurity, and this should go beyond just political agreements and should involve some practical implementation methods and mechanisms. That's what's important. Thank you so much. Since we talked a lot about France, I think it would be natural if we could give the floor now to Julien Nocetti. The question is, how applicable are the other agreements or regimes to the cybersphere? And can you also comment on the idea of creating an alliance with Russia in the sphere of cryptography, as opposed to the United States interference?
Yeah, so use questions. No, first of all, I'm always skeptical. I'm sorry just to say that, but I'm skeptical about comparing nuclear and cyber for a very simple reason, which might seem commonplace. But anyway, I mean, the impact of cyber or internet technologies, if you want, is systemic, and it innervates all common spaces, land, air, space, and whatever like. Unlike, I mean, the nuclear factor and the cyber has key human and economic impact. So here we just have to deal with the very different, impact and aspects of the nuclear stuff. I totally understand that for diplomats dealing also with questions of strategic stability and so on, it's quite natural to compare both domains and both issues. But given what we told before about the pace of technologies being much faster than the pace of law and so on, so pace of law and the pace of diplomatic activities. I think the comparison with nuclear is not, ideal. Yeah, and just stop here. And on your second question about alliances, and if I'm right, the question was what about forming alliance with Russia against other countries? Am I right? What
Not against other countries. Насколько я понимаю, вопрос был в том, что у Франции нет независимых.
The question was that that France doesn't have its own cryptography system, and maybe it would make sense to combine its efforts, join its efforts with other nations, including, for example, Russia in the area of cryptography.
Yeah, I'm not sure I've understood everything on this question. I'm sorry. Yeah, no, I'm not going to answer if I don't understand all the key stuff. I'm sorry about that, Yelena, but yeah.
Спасибо, Julien, большое. Я тогда переадресую вопрос о применимости.
Thank you very much, Julien. And now I would like to ask the question about the applicability of such agreements and regimes to the area of cybersecurity and technologies. Of course, every special sphere is discussed using its own language, using its own methodology, and that's well clear and understood. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be tapping the experience of other agreements that have been created in other parallel spheres. And it seems to me that at one point, working with the US counterparts, and James Lewis knows this very well, as perhaps the initiator of this idea, we heard these ideas expressed by the Americans that we don't have to build the negotiations using the principles and precedent of strategic weapons, but what has really shown to be quite successful is the experience of making agreements not just between the USSR and the United States and the USSR and France and the UK. I'm talking about agreements about prevention of incidents in the open sea and in the space above it. It seems like these are very different spheres, but the logic remains the same. Cyber sphere is a new sphere, and there are now different players behaving differently. Some of them are behaving as loose cannons. And we saw that happening in the 1950s and the 1960s on the seas and in the airspace. But the countries then chose to sit down and develop the protocols for what happens when ships approach each other from different countries. What happens when airplanes identify themselves in the airspace. And that has resulted in ridding the world from lots of incidents that had taken place on a number of occasions in the past. And that also prevented the world from incidents in this very delicate sphere that could lead to a major war. What is preventing us from using the logic and the approach, the general approach of this in the cybersphere? And that's why I'm saying that we shouldn't copy everything and use the experience from other spheres blindly, but use the things that can be used rationally to support the idea of making the information space, the cyberspace, more secure and safer, prevent these incidents from happening. And this shows me that there is a difference, a fundamental difference between the conflict management and conflict prevention. Please note that the agreement that we made between the United States and Russia on prevention of incidents in the sea and in the airspace, it was not conflict management, it was prevention, but it all led to agreeing on who needs to send a signal to whom, what should be the safe distance, very elementary things of safe behavior on the seas and in the airspace. That's what we are suggesting. We suggest that the experts sit down together at the negotiating table and discuss what could out of this be used, instead of copying that, for the cyber and information space? And what's so wrong about this? But the real problem is that for a long time, the United States have been avoiding taking part in these talks, and they prevented the Europeans from engaging with us on this topic. But I would like to express the hope that things are changing objectively, and one way or another, cyber behavior rules are going to be developed, because there is no alternative to doing that. Thank you. We have 3 minutes before we are to end this event. Mr. Lewis, do you have anything to say at the conclusion of this based on what you've heard so far?
Well, thank you. It's been a fascinating discussion, and it's a pleasure to see all my colleagues. Let me make a few quick points. First of all, it's been a long-standing goal to try and split the US from its allies. I don't think that's going to work because we have shared values. Now, the US itself might succeed in splitting with its allies, but other countries won't be able to do that. And so the task for the Biden administration is to rebuild the alliances that we once had with other democracies. And of course, if a D12 doesn't make sense, I would suggest that a BRICS doesn't make sense either. It's interesting to look at the powers involved. Europe, of course, is considering how to extend its sovereignty. This has implications for relations with the US. China, Russia will probably never be partners in any meaningful way. Japan, we already are a partner. And of course, the one that's in play is India. So cybersecurity takes, because India doesn't like China, and that is not going to change either. So cybersecurity takes place in this larger geopolitical context. And in that context, we don't want to pretend that there isn't conflict. We want to think how we should manage it. I'll stop. Thank you.
Спасибо большое. Мне кажется, очень хорошие заключительные слова.
Thank you so much. If anyone else doesn't want to say anything in addition, I think this is a great way to finish this discussion. I think these last comments have added a little bit of optimism to our discussion, and I hope that together with the Gorchakov Fund, we're going to be able to continue this discussion either in this format or in other formats, and that will give us other reasons to be optimistic. I would like to thank all of the speakers, all of the participants, and all of the listeners of this discussion, including those online. And now give the floor back to Daria. Thank you, Yelena. And I would also like to join your thanks to those who decided to join our discussion. It was great for us to see all of the distinguished experts taking part in this. This is the first time we've worked with most of you, but we're really thankful that in this short period of time, at such short notice, you agreed to participate and discuss information and cybersecurity now. And I would be happy to see you all again to continue the discussion. And I would like to thank you for your honest and sincere opinions. We will preserve this discussion on our YouTube channel so that you could view it and see it again. And would be thankful to you if you would be, when talking to other audiences, that you would refer to the Gorchakov Foundation discussion, especially if you're a journalist and you are covering this event today. Thank you so much. And until we see you again, thank you so much.
Спасибо всем большое.